already demanded a £17 billion emergency budget for the NHS, social care, schools and local government. The trouble is, as I said at the beginning, we are up to our eyes in debt. Can extra spending from Labour really just come from a few offshore hedge funds? I'm joined by Mr McDonnell now. Something weird is going on in politics at the moment. The government are not having, it might be said, a happy time in all sorts of ways. And yet you're not way ahead in the polls. You're kind of level pegging. That must be a worry. Why do you think it's happening?
I think it's the usual thing. Is with an incumbent government, they're usually ahead unless there's a huge economic crisis. That's what happened like ERM, for example, and the banking crisis. But if you look on economic credibility, we're still behind. I think it's by about 6 to 8 points.
Quite a long way behind.
Well, 12 months ago, we were 28 points behind. So we're narrowing the gap all the time. And I think what we're trying to do now is have a serious debate in advance of the budget so we can demonstrate again that we've got the vision for the future, but also the detail of the plans.
And you want an emergency budget, because I'm going to give the Chancellor the same opportunity. Just tell us a little bit about what you want as an emergency budget and why.
Well, look, if we'd been elected, I published the Grey Book, which is the costing of our manifesto.
Dark blue tie, Grey Book.
Well, I published the Grey Book, which set out our plans. So that would be the detail of our plans. But what I've said to him is the messages that are coming from the front line of our public services, and also for those who are suffering from universal credit, is really hitting at people hard. On NHS, the Simon Stevens, the chief exec, said, you know, if we don't get more investment, there'll be 5 million on the waiting list. In terms of what's happening to education, 5,000 head teachers writing to the Prime Minister saying halt the school cuts, the first per pupil cuts since the 1990s. What we've said is there's a range of things they're asking for that we'd covered in our manifesto and our Grey Book that he could fund, not through borrowing, because our fiscal credibility rule said you can only borrow to invest, you mustn't borrow for day-to-day.
Therefore, you have to raise taxes.
What we said is end the tax cuts to the corporations, first of all. That's the first thing. And over the lifetime of this Parliament, £76 billion being paid out. And that includes...
So that's going to hit corporate profits, and therefore that's going to hit employment.
Well, it's interesting. Well, let me explore that, Andrew, because what's happened is the government has been cutting corporation tax. That actually has meant that earned income by these corporations is being stacked up and not invested. So we now know the figures of the last year.
So you want to force corporations to reinvest more money, in
Ideally,
effect.
what we want to say is stop giving the tax cuts to the corporations and the rich and recognise you've got an emergency out there in terms of public services. Invest in those public services.
And somehow this message has not yet quite cut through to the public.
Well, I think
could I put it to you? The reason is that people understand that we are very, very heavily over-borrowed at the moment, and they look at your plans and it's more money here, more money there, more money everywhere,
but that's
and
why
it's just too much.
Yes, but that's why I'm saying we mustn't borrow for day-to-day expenditure. We can only borrow to invest. And it's not just me saying this in terms of investment. You had Sajid Javid on here, a cabinet minister, a couple of weeks ago, asking for more housing. And what did he say? He said interest rates are so low that now's the time to borrow for investment, and I agree.
But they're going up, aren't they?
Yes.
I mean, I'd like to go through, if I may, and ask you some questions we've talked about before in this programme, where I feel I haven't really had the answers that I want. You have a very ambitious programme for more nationalisation of the railways, Royal Mail and the utilities. How much is that going to cost?
Right. What we've said, and this is very clear cut, and I said it before, when you take them over, you don't need a number, because what you do is you swap shares for government bonds, and that is covered by the cost of those profitable industries we take over.
But government bonds is still government spending.
Yes, it is.
It's still borrowing.
And it will be Parliament who sets the price on any of those nationalisations. But what I'm saying is the cost is always covered because these are profitable industries, and that will cover the cost of any borrowing.
That may be the case in due course, but right at the beginning the cost isn't covered. I'm saying again, how much will taxpayers actually have to spend to renationalise those things? It's a simple question.
There will not be a burden on taxpayers. The price will be set by Parliament, government bonds will be issued, and any cost of government bonds will be covered by the income from those profitable industries. In fact, what we think, and it's not just us saying this.
It sounds a bit like a magic card trick, this.
Well, it isn't, because it's been done elsewhere, and it's been done, being done across Europe as well now. You know, in Paris, water has been brought back into public ownership. Right. Why? Because people feel they're being ripped off by profiteers. OK, so no number on that. What about bringing PFI back in-house? You made that famous speech at a conference saying, I'm going to bring them all back in again. What is the cost of that? That's right, again. We know there's
no cost at all.
No, let me just explain. We know that there's £200 billion committed in PFI from here on in. We think the costs of those are too heavy. We're going to review the PFI schemes and go through them, and then we will do deals on bringing them back. And we think...
But this is I'm sorry, this is a very big promise that you personally have made, and you must have some sense of the upfront cost.
Well, again...
Upfront cost.
Well, again, when you bring them back, you will make a saving because you're not paying out the expensive amounts of money in profits for those private companies.
But you still have to buy out those PFI contracts. That does cost money.
And over the life of those contracts, the savings will pay for it. But what we'll do, and this is what I said at conference, we'll go through every individual scheme. There'll be consultation. And, you know, I think not only will we get a better deal financially, we'll get a better deal in terms of service delivery as well.
OK, eventually you think it'll work. But again, as with the nationalisation thing, you can't give me a number. Can I give you one last number I'm going to try and get to? All of this, all your planning is based upon you invest a lot of money at the beginning, and as a result, the economy grows faster. And because the economy is growing faster, you get more taxes in and everything balances. By how much does the economy need to go for your plans to work?
OK, let me just go through because people need to understand what we're saying, because a lot of figures have been bandied around.
I'm just looking for one figure would do me.
I'll give you a figure.
All right.
What we're saying is we invest £250 billion over a 10-year programme, so about 25 billion a year. This is nothing untoward. It's what past governments have done. In fact, if we don't do this, we're not keeping up with our competitors across Europe, US and elsewhere. That will bring in a return as you invest that money. And you know as well as I do...
This is eye-watering sums. This is £250 billion.
Over a 10-year period, this is what governments have done in the past and governments are doing across Europe. If we don't do that, we will not be able to keep up with our international competitors. And what that happens, you know as well as I do, when you invest those sums, look at what recent reports by PwC, you get a return on that investment that covers any cost of borrowing.
If it's well invested and it goes into the right areas.
Of course.
And all of that.
That's why I said at Labour Party conference, we're setting up a strategic investment board which brings together, yes, myself, Secretary of State for Business, the Governor of the Bank of England, business representatives that will direct that investment. And in that way, we'll get the best deal, but more importantly, we'll be able to compete in a global market.
You have been a bit of an Eeyore about the economy for a while. I still, by the way, have not got a number on the growth figure. Can we get to that at the end?
Well,
by how much does the economy, for this to work, for this big plan to work, by how much does the economy need to grow?
It's not the economy growing, it's the individual investments. What return will we get on those? And on those returns, you always get, if you wisely invest, and that's what we'll do, you'll always get more than you have to pay out.
I was just wanting a number. No. Just one little number. Well, just one tiny little number.
You're asking the wrong question in terms of overall growth, because it's about individual investments. Right. 250 billion, as I said, we're putting in through our investment through mainstream programmes. We're all setting up, and it's interesting, this has been supported in a whole range of commentators, a national investment bank, which will bring in 250 from the private sector. And I'm talking to asset managers at the moment, and what they're saying to me, obviously these are confidential discussions, but what they're saying to me is that they're welcoming our stable investment programmes, both in terms of what we're suggesting for public, but also private.
So out there, people are listening to you, they're saying, there is John McDonnell with a Tory dark blue tie on, a white shirt, he's got his grey book there, and he spends his time hanging around with asset managers. And yet they're still not completely convinced. And it's maybe because you have been so gloomy, Eeyore-ish about the economy for so long. You've said 3 times in the last 6 years we were heading for a recession, and in one case for a full depression.
Well, I tell you,
it never has happened.
I don't think I said, I don't say a depression. I said this could lead to if we're not careful about what's happening. And that's what happens when you push austerity. But should I just say this to you? For many people out there, this is a depression. We've had people whose wages have been cut by 10%, nurses, for example. We've had people who are now 1.25 million food parcels handed out in the 6th richest country in the world. That's what I call a recession for large numbers of people. And at the same time, this government is giving tax cuts to the super rich and corporations. That's the difference that we have, the grotesque inequality in our society.
There are lots of dark, cold shadows across the economy.
Yes.
It's absolutely right. But overall, the happiness index has gone to the highest level since 2011. That's surely bizarre news from your point of view. People are happier.
Well, go and say that. And ask Philip Hammond this. When did he ask to visit a food bank? When
That's a completely different question.
No, it isn't a different question.
I'm talking about the overall level of national happiness.
I'm talking to you about the levels of insecurity in our society. For the first time, I'll quote you opinion polls, for the first time now, we have people saying of all generations that for the next generation it will be worse off for them. When I was young, we always thought there'd be a steady increase in the quality of living.
Okay.
That no longer applies because young people these days can't expect even the same living standards as their parents.
Statutory requirement. I must ask you at least one question about Brexit.
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of difficult, tough talks over the last week. One of the big issues the Irish Taoiseach has raised before is what happens to the border in Northern Ireland. Now, it seems that there are two obvious choices. Either all of Ireland, north and south, can stay inside the customs union and the single market and a border around that, or there's going to have to be a real tough border of some kind between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. On which side of that argument do you fall?
Bringing back a hard border, I think, would be a nightmare. I think it would not be practical anyway. I think we have to have a relationship which is as close to the customs union as we possibly can. So you would because I would not want to see anything that undermines the peace process in particular and all the gains that we've had. And a hard border would undermine that relationship that's been built up between North and South so delicately.
So you would have no principled political objection to Northern Ireland staying in the customs union and the single market? Otherwise it doesn't make sense.
We're not saying the customs union, we're saying a customs union, and that's the discussion that should be had. But, you know...
So you could have a unique arrangement for Northern Ireland, in effect?
I think that's part of the discussions that need to take place, but we've got to give assurances to people in Ireland that we will not go backwards on this. We must not jeopardise the peace process in any way.
You have spent your entire political career believing in a united Ireland. Is it possible that united Ireland comes about not through Armalites or political parties and all the rest of it, but through the EU?
Well, no, the Irish people will decide whether or not their future, and it won't be to the EU or us, it'll be the Irish people themselves. And we've always said that.
But it'll effectively become one economy.
I think that's a separate issue altogether. The key issue for us now is to make sure that there's an arrangement which doesn't damage the economies, north and south, but at the same time doesn't undermine all that goodwill that's been built up as a result of the peace process.
We'll keep a close eye on it. John McDonnell, thanks very much indeed.